but anyway. Okay. Someone asked, Justin actually, asked about the concept of water and what water means in Kabbalistic terminology. Well, the truth is that there's a tremendous amount of material that could be covered, but suffice it to say that we're not going to cover everything, but just some of the very interesting ideas. Let me start off by sharing a screen, and you will see one verse about water from which much is derived. I'm assuming the sound is good. This is a quote from Proverbs, from Mishlei. Kamaim apanim lapanim kain lev ha'adam la'adam. As water reflects a face, so too the heart of one person to another. In other words, if you're looking into water, you are looking at you're standing over a lake of still water. Your face is reflected in the water. The face that you show is a face that will be shown back to you, right? It's just like you were looking to a mirror, the same kind of thing. In other words, you will see the face that you show. Now, this is very important in understanding the nature of water, because the nature of water in spiritual terms is actually it's a marshal, it's a, how do you call it, an analogy for what's going on in various inner forces in the person. And there are actually two of them. The reflection of the face, not the face itself, it's only a reflection. And the reflection is not acquired by the water on a permanent basis. In other words, once you move your face away, once you move away from the water, the reflection is no longer there, obviously. Now, what does that mean? Well, let's first discuss it in terms of the actual nature of water, chemically speaking. So, as we all know, the chemical formula for water is H2O, right? In other words, two atoms rather of hydrogen and one atom of oxygen make a bond and they form a water molecule, H2O. So the interesting thing about water molecules is that they behave in a very unusual way. There's a very unusual chemical bond between hydrogen and oxygen, and the two hydrogen atoms that are part of the picture. And it says like this, and this is from Wikipedia: in a water molecule, hydrogen atoms form 104.5 degree angle with the oxygen atom. In other words, here's the oxygen atom, and there are the hydrogen atoms at 104 degrees from each other, the two corners of a tetrahedron centered on the oxygen. But in a perfect tetrahedron, the atoms would form a 109.5 degree angle. Now, this is very interesting. Why it doesn't form a 109.5 degree angle, which it really should, because that's the, in fact, let's take it even a little bit further. Very often you'll have a bond that will look like this. I'll just use X and Z as you have an X and then an equal sign and a Z and an equal sign and another X, right? X and Z and X, they form a bond. Now, generally this bond will be 180 degrees. In other words, it'll be just a straight bond, a straight chemical bond. So it'll be, this will be 180 degrees from the X, will be 180 degrees from the X. In other words, it'll basically be what you would call a straight line, right? It'll just be a straight line. Maybe we could do it like this, a straight line like this. Well, that's not exactly a straight line, but anyway, you get the picture. But water does not form that kind of bond. It forms a bond where the hydrogen atoms are not bonded to two opposite sides of the oxygen, but both on the same side, and then there's two lone electron pairs around the oxygen. In other words, there's two atoms here, two electrons here, two electrons there, two electrons there, two electrons there. The hydrogen bonds with the oxygen here and here, right? Instead of bonding at much larger angles. Now, why is that? So the explanation is because of the following idea. I'm going to have to erase this so you can get everything on the page. Because of its polarity, a molecule of water in the liquid or solid state can form up to 4 hydrogen bonds, etc. A hydrogen bond's about 10 times as strong. All right, that's all irrelevant, actually. I don't know why I have it there. But the main thing is that there is polarity in water. What do we mean by polarity? Well, basically, the oxygen atom is positive, and the two hydrogen atoms are negative. Oxygen is positive, and the two hydrogen atoms are negative. Therefore, when you get a molecule of water, you'll have a positive on one side. A positive on one side, where would that be? Just 1 second. Yeah. And a negative on the other side. In other words, the oxygen will be positive and the hydrogen will also be positive. But the interesting thing is that the hydrogen bonds attract each other and they work towards each other. In other words, they pull in towards each other. They pull in towards each other. And that's what makes the bond only 104.5 degrees instead of 109 degrees, because the hydrogen atoms pull towards one another. Now, let's take the word in Hebrew. The word for water in Hebrew is mayim, mem, yud, mem. But you'll notice there's a difference between the first mem and the second mem. Those of you who don't read Hebrew, just be aware that there are 5 letters in the Hebrew alphabet that have 2 forms. They have a form when they're in the middle of the word or the beginning of a word, beginning or middle of a word, and they have a form where at the end, where they're at the end of the word. For example, the mem, which is what you see over here, the mem has another form which is called a final mem. As the final letter of a word, it takes a different form. Similarly, a nun has a long nun, tadi has a different pay, and chaf. These are called, for short, they're called mansepach. If you read them out, it's called mansepach. These are called the 5 gevurot in Kabbalistic terminology. Let me just show you what we're talking about over here. Okay. We're talking about the concept of chesed and gevura. Now, chesed, kindness, represents oxygen. That's the oxygen element. Whereas the hydrogen represents gevura. Gevura means, it can mean strength, it can mean power, might, but it can also mean constriction, confinement. The concept of gevura as constriction is what explains why, and I'm sorry, I meant to say that there are 5 aspects of chesed and there are 5 aspects of gevura. We just saw the 5 aspects of gevura in the mansepach, in these letters over here. The final letters are the gevurot. So therefore, you would expect that in water, the yud in water represents oxygen, and the mem, both mems represent hydrogen. But there's a difference between the first mem and the second mem. The second mem is a concept of gevura. And therefore, you will find actually that in the oxygen molecule, in the water molecule, although there are 2 hydrogen atoms, one is of a greater negative quality than the other. And the other seems to have some kind of positive force to it as well. So the one that's more negative, in other words, the one that's more gevura, the one that's more constricted, that would be the final mem. So therefore, the bond of water, when we come to the concept of water, water is regarded as a special, almost unique quality. There are a number of you can look this up yourself. There are a number of videos on this concept of the bond of hydrogen and oxygen in water and how it's pretty much unique, very unusual. But nevertheless, water is regarded, therefore, as being reflected in the word for water. As everybody knows, the Kabbalistic, and not only the Kabbalistic, but this is also according to Medrash, that God looked into the Torah and he created the world, right? He looked into the Torah and created the world. In other words, the Torah precedes the world, and the creation of the world comes from the letters of the Torah. Therefore, the Torah as it was, Torah Kadumana, in other words, the Torah as it was before, it was actually written down into the 5 books of Moses. Before it was written down, it's called the Torah Kaduma, the primordial Torah, which is the Torah. In other words, the purpose of creation, as well as the plan of creation, 2 different levels. The purpose and the plan of creation, all laid out, so to speak, in God's mind. This is reflected in what is called the Machshava HaKeduma Da'ak of Adam Kadmon. The primordial thought of Adam Kadmon is the one aspect of it, is the aspect of the blueprint for all of creation. The blueprint for creation is there. When the blueprint comes into actuality through what is called divine speech. The divine speech in the beginning of Genesis, in the first chapter of Genesis, the divine speech is the 10 utterances by which the world was created. Vayomer Elokim yehi or vayhi, or God said there shall be light, and there was light. And so it goes on. Vayhi mayim, and God said there shall be water, and there was water. Interestingly enough, it also says like this. It also says like this, that the letter Aleph in Hebrew, the Aleph, all right, if you look at it like that, the letter Aleph represents 2 different aspects. It represents the letter Yud, oops, why did it change? I don't know. The letter Yud, and the letter Yud at the top over here. The letter Yud is the smallest letter in the alphabet. That's if you increase the size of this Aleph, let me see if I can do that. Make it a little bit easier to see. Oop, go on to the next page. Okay, so at the top of the Aleph over here, I don't really have a pointer that I could show you, but at the top of the Aleph over here is a Yud, the letter Yud, and at the bottom is another letter Yud. The way it's actually written in scripture, in the Torah, is actually, you'll be able to see that much easier. I could get you a picture of it, but I don't know if we want to waste the time doing that. But in any event, that would be a Yud and that would be a Yud. And if you see the Aleph in script, actually, maybe I could do that. Let me just see if I could do it easily. I don't know if it is. Let's see here. No, it's not going to do it. Let's see. No. Let me just see if I can find. Script. It's all the way down in script. I don't know. I don't see it here, but in any event, if anyone's interested, I can show them a picture of it. You will be able to see it much better. Oh, here, maybe in Frank Rule, it will be easier to see. Yes, there you can see it. Here is the Yud on the top. There's the Yud on the bottom, joined by a line. This is called the higher waters. That's called the lower waters. And they're joined by the rakia, by the sky that separates the higher waters. In other words, the clouds and the water above, in the atmosphere above, and the water down below, the water that is manifested in pools of water in the sea, in rivers, and so on and so forth. Rivers and springs, right? So there's Yud above or Yud below, connected by a Vav, which is the Rakia, the separation between the two, but they're nevertheless connected. That goes back to what we said before, that there are two aspects of a person's face. In other words, the face that he shows and the face that's reflected. And there are two aspects of water, the higher water and the lower water. Okay, so what do we gain from this? What's the idea? Well, the idea is as follows: that the word mayim in Hebrew, the word mayim was the paradigm, if you want to call it that, the paradigm for the creation of water. In other words, that word mem yud mem, as we had it over here, the word mayim over here, mayim, is the paradigm for the way water is supposed to work, and therefore you will find that the word mayim, the Hebrew word for water, has two different mems, and that explains why these hydrogen atoms are much closer together than they actually should be. Instead of 109 degrees, 109.5, the 104.5 degree angle, because the two mems, so to speak, attract each other. They're two of the same thing, and they attract each other, they move towards each other. But one of them is the negative bond, that's the negative aspect of the bond, and that's shown up by the last letter of the word mayim. Okay, now enough of these ideas in scientific terminology. Let's get on to the more Kabbalistic terminology. What do we mean when we say that there's a higher water and lower waters? So for this, there are numerous explanations, all of them correct, but all of them talking about different worlds, different planes of reality in which the same concept of water occurs. If water is the source of life on Earth, water is also, in general, the concept of the divine outpouring of kindness, because the word mayim altogether is primarily the idea of kindness, God's kindness. So the word mayim represents kindness, which is why if you remember the story with Eliezer, servant of Abraham, when he went to go and find a wife for Abraham's son Isaac, so he met Rivka. Rivka was the son of Bethuel, descendant of Laban, and the father of Laban, rather, not the descendant of, the father of Laban. And he asked his test, immediately Eliezer's test to find the right person for Yitzchak was to find a woman who exhibited tremendous kindness. He saw this girl just about to start watering her flock, and he asked her if it was possible for her to water to give him some water as well. So not only did she give him water, but she gave his camels water as well. And as you probably know, camels drink a tremendous amount. It was bearing camels. He was riding on camels at the time. Camels drink a tremendous amount. You know, the hump in the camel is all stored water because they traverse the desert and so on and so forth. They store water. So the fact that she poured out so much water for him from the well, she was a young girl at the time, showed him that this was a woman of chesed. Why did he particularly need a woman of chesed? Because Yitzchak, Isaac, is the concept of gevura. He was the concept of sort of self-isolation. Isaac lived primarily in the higher world. He didn't live in the world down below. He lived in a world which was a transcendent world. That's where he lived. That's mostly where his attention was. Not that he didn't have any attention on the world around him when he needed to, but mostly his focus was on the supernal world. Why is that a concept of Gevura? Because Gevura is to withdraw from interaction to a certain extent. And he did withdraw from interaction to a great extent. It wasn't like Abraham. Abraham was exactly the opposite. Abraham was chesed. And he would go out and he would encourage people and so on and so forth. Isaac spent most of his time in prayer and meditation. Isaac went out to the fields to pray, according to one translation, or to meditate, according to another translation. He was involved in the higher worlds. That was his thing. The same thing is true of water in general. There's a higher aspect of water and there's a lower aspect of water. The higher aspect of water is actually the Gevura aspect of water. The lower aspect of water is the water that feeds all of us. Now, there's two aspects of water that are spoken about in the Torah. One is the water that we drink, and the other is the water that purifies. This is called the water of a mikveh. Mikveh is a ritual bath where a person goes to purify themselves from spiritual impurity. In biblical times, it was necessary for men to go to the mikveh before to go to this ritual pool, which holds a certain amount of water, and it's usually connected to a living source of water. In other words, not to a, it's connected to a spring, often connected to spring, not always, but it's a pool of water that comes from spring water, right? It has to come from spring water or from rainwater, but it has to come from a natural source. It can't just be mayim she'uvim, water that they drew by bucket or whatever, or by a hose pipe or whatever other means. It has to be water that is comes from a natural source. So how does one purify oneself? One immerses oneself in the water. Actually, this is for women. This is a constant commandment, a mitzvah, which is performed even in these times as well, to purify a woman from her menstrual cycle. After the menstrual cycle, she goes to the mikvah, and then she's pure. She's regarded as pure for her to enter into relations with during the menstrual cycle, as relations are forbidden with her husband. So sexual relations afterwards are permitted as long as she is purified by the waters of the mikvah. So this purity affects everybody. So there's two aspects, therefore, of water. The water that we drink, that sustains life, and the water that sustains the spiritual life, the spiritual water. This, the water of the mikveh, the water of this ritual bath. I don't know why we call it a bath, but ritual pond maybe would be a better, whatever. In any event, the idea is, actually, I don't have to share the screen anymore, do I? The idea is that the concept of water has two aspects. The lower aspect, which is the aspect of chesed, the water that feeds us, the water that nourishes and sustains life on earth, and the water that is above. It's called, in Kabbalah, it's called Kala de Bedulcha. It's dew which is crystallized dew. Now, it's a very complicated concept. I'm not going to go into the whole idea. As we know, dew comes from above. But this is the dew as it is above. It's called, that dew, yeah, this water source of spring is called living water, yes. Yes, it's called living water. Coming to the splitting of the Sea of Reeds, I don't know that we'll get to it today, but maybe in a future lecture we will get to it. But in any event, to just continue this idea, the higher level of water is actually what is called the 5 gevurot of Atik Yomin. Now, let me go back to our diagram of the Sfirot. So I have to share screen again. The diagram of the Sfirot is as follows. There's Chesed and Gevura, as we know, on the lower level, but in Keter, the highest of the Sfirot, there are actually 3 levels. The highest level is called Resha de Lois Yada, or Radla, for short, the level which is not known at all. Resha, the head, which is not known, the beginning that is not known. But the other 2 levels are called Atik Yomin, and Arich Anpin. Let me write these down for you. So I'll have to stop share for a minute. Get back to the share the piece of paper here. Here we are. And I will write these down. All right, there is the highest level of Keter is called Atik. And that is also called it's just not working out for me today. As I put one foot up, the other one goes down. Okay, there we go. Anyway, Atik, there's Atik and Atik Yomin. Atik and Atik Yomin. Atik is the Chesed Gvur, is the Chochma Bina, or the Keter Chochma Bina of Atik, and Atik Yomin is the Midot, the emotional qualities of Chesed Gvur Tiferet Netzach Hod Yesod. So Atik would be called Keter Chochma Bina of Atik, Keter Chochma Bina of Atik, and Atik Yomin would be Chesed Gevura Tiferet Netzach Hod Yesod, Netzach Hod Yesod, Netzach Hod Yesod. Okay, these would be, as you can see on the diagram of the Sfirot. I don't know if you can see that now. Can you see the Sfirot now, or is it not sharing the Sfirot? It should be. But in any event, there's Chochma Bina, Keter Chochma Bina. That's Atik itself. And then Chesed Gvur Tiferet Netzach Hod Yesod. Before we get to Malchut, that is what's called Atik Yomin. Okay, now we have to explain a little bit further. In Atik itself, there's what is called the Gvurot of Atik. What are the Gvurot of Atik? This is the Bina of Atik. The female quality of Bina of Atik is the source of the 5 Gvurot of Atik. Chochma is the source of the 5 Chasadim, the 5 aspects of Chesed, of kindness of Atik. Bina is the 5 Gvurot of Atik. And these 5 Gvurot are reflected, as we said before, in these letters here called the 5 Gvurot. In other words, on the highest level, these letters come from the 5 Gvurot of Bina of Atik, of Bina of Atik. So, where then is the water of kindness? In other words, the water that sustains life, that comes from Chochmah. The water that comes from Bina is the water of purification, which is why this concept of purification applies in our times, in any event, primarily to women. Chochmah is a male sphera, Bina, so to speak, a female sphera, right? Chochmah is called Abba, Bina is called Ima, father and mother, right? In order for there to be a unity of Chochmah and Bina, for Chochmah and Bina to be able to come together, to bond, which is the desirable thing, therefore, they have to both be on a level of purity. But the level of purity of Bina is higher than the level of purity of Chochmah to a certain extent. Why? Because the 5 Gvurot of Atik, and that is the concept of purification of those down below, removing the state of impurity down in the world below. Where does that state of impurity get removed from? It comes from Bina of Atik, from the 5 Gvurot of Bina of Atik. That is what is called Tala de Bedolcha, the crystallized dew, so to speak, of that descends from Atik. So therefore, the concept of water altogether is, in fact, a very fascinating concept. There's much more to be said about the idea of water. And there are many parallels as well as many verses that explain the concept of water. One of the concepts of water is called Makor Mayim Chaim, living waters. What are living waters? Well, living waters are waters that are connected to their source. In other words, connected to a spring, connected to an underground source of water, to a spring. And that concept is how the water flows out from Chokhmah. Whereas Mayim Tahorim is as the water, how the water flows out from Bina, the waters of purity, or the pure waters as they flow forth from Bina of, ultimately, the ultimate source is Bina of Atik, Bina of Atik of Keter. Okay, let's go a little bit further. This concept of kindness, that water represents kindness because water represents giving life to others. Therefore, you will find right throughout the 5 books of Moses, right throughout the Torah, and in fact in the works of the prophets as well, that water is always a symbol of how much people care essentially for each other. And their kindness is exhibited in the water. Now, to go back to the verse that we said that we started off with, as water reflects a face, so too the heart of one person to another. In other words, as water reflects a face, you look into the water, the face you show is the face you see. If you show a happy face, it's happy. If you show a sad face, it's sad. An angry face, it's angry, and so on and so forth. The water just reflects what it is that you're feeling at that particular point in time, what it is that you're projecting at that particular point in time. So too, the heart of one person to another is, as you project your heart outwards, in other words, as you project your kindness, the response of the other person in general, if the person is not crazy, the response of the other person is also a response of kindness, a response of chesed, a response of openness. Of course, if the heart of one person is closed, and that's the aspect that the person projects, the concept of being closed, the concept of gvura, of harshness, of withdrawal, then that will be the response of the other person as well, as is clear from the analogy. So the water that's reflected is the heart of the other person. That's the reflection in the water, and that's usually a reflection of what your approach to that other person is. So water therefore represents a very important bond in terms of human relationships as well. It's not only a very important bond in terms of chemical relationships, it's a very important bond in terms of human relationships. There's much more to be discussed about water, but I think that's enough for tonight. That is a good question. That's a good question. How does this relate to you shall pass through the waters? I will be with you when you pass through the rivers. They will not sweep you over. That's really referring the waters, passing through the waters is also referring to the splitting of the sea at the time of the Exodus from Egypt, when the sea split and the Israelites went through the middle of the sea, and the Egyptians followed them and were drowned. The waters closed. And when you pass through the rivers, they will not sweep you and sweep over you. That's talking about in the future. In the future redemption, in other words, in the Messianic era, when Messiah comes, then too there will be a splitting of the waters, but it'll be on a higher level. The splitting of the waters at the time of the Exodus from Egypt was the splitting of the Sphira of Malchut. The Yam represents the sea, represents the sphere of Malchut, and Malchut split open, allowing passage to higher dimensions of spirituality, to the higher dimensions, the higher sphirot that are above Malchut. Let me just show you the picture over here. 1 second again, share screen. Here we go. Okay, so when Malchut split, that allowed them to transcend to this higher level. Essentially, that transcended to here. It was only when they were given the Torah that the transcendence was to this level, right? The level of Keter Chochmah Bina. That's only when they received the Torah, when they received the 5 books of Moses, essentially the 10 Commandments, and then the 5 books of Moses afterwards. But that was the splitting of the sea. Whereas the splitting of the river refers to the splitting of Bina. The splitting of Bina. Bina is the river. And the river is compared to Bina. It's flowing out from a spring. The spring is actually Chochmah, but the flow outside is Bina. And when that river splits, that means that the essence of Chochmah and beyond Chochmah, Keter as well, will be revealed. That is what will happen. That's what will happen in the Messianic era, and that's what that verse is talking about in Isaiah that you mentioned. Okay, let's see if there's other questions. What about the cup or chalice? In all religions, consultation must be meaningful as well. Yes. Yes, definitely. Generally, a cup is also the concept of Malchut. It's the concept of Malchut, that which contains the water or contains the liquid, contains the wine. Wine, again, is Bina. But the cup that contains the wine has to be lifted up. Kot Yeshuot Esa. I will lift up the cup of salvation. The cup of Malchut has to be lifted to a higher level. Why does it have to be lifted to a higher level? Because Malchut needs to bond with Zeir Anpin. And ultimately, Malchut needs to bond with Bina and then with Chochmah. Because Chochmah is the first manifestation of divinity, of godliness in a manifest way. In other words, in what's called Mamalekol, in the light that fills the world, the immanent light. Whereas Malchut is the lowest level. And the lowest level of light, Na'ut, the Sefer Yetzirah, explains that Na'ut Tchilatan B'Sofan, the beginning is wedged in the end. In other words, Chochmah is wedged in Malchut. And even higher than that, Keter is wedged in Malchut. That's why Malchut is sometimes called Keter Malchut. Malchut, as it is, the Sphira of Malchut becomes the Keter of the next world down, becomes the crown of the next world down. Whereas Malchut in its own world is the lowest Sphira. Nevertheless, ultimately, it will rise up to bond with Keter, so that Keter and Malchut will be together, which is partly the whole story of Purim is related to this idea of Keter Malchut. It's a phrase that is mentioned several times in the Megillah, Keter Malchut, and there's many explanations, so on and so forth. Yes, Malchut is elevated to Zeir Anpin every Friday evening. That is true, and that is at the time of Kiddush, when one makes the sanctification over a cup of wine. The cup represents Malchut. The wine in it represents higher than Zeir Anpin, in fact, Bina. And when one says the Kiddush, you hold the cup in your hand, in your 5 fingers like this, right? It's held sort of in the cup of your hand like this, right? That's the way the cup is held. And when you say the blessing over the wine, Borei Pri Hagafen, you're supposed to lift the cup up, symbolizing that ascent of Malchut to a higher level. The ascent of Malchut to Zeir Anpin, and ultimately the yichud, the unity of Zeir Anpin and Malchut, comes about through the power of Bina. And that's why the wine represents Bina, because this sanctification, this process of sanctification, is very much like the process of sanctification in the mikveh, in the ritual pool in which one immerses. It's the same kind of thing. Even though we drink the wine, we don't bury ourselves, we don't immerse ourselves in the wine. Nevertheless, the wine represents Bina, represents that higher level. All right, I think we'll call it a day. And sorry for the beginning, that was not exactly so smooth, but we'll have to come to that next time when I find the text. Okay, all the best, everybody. Have a good weekend. Good rest of your week and a good weekend. And hopefully see you next week. All the best. You are very welcome, everybody. You're welcome.